My name is Chamila Liyanage. I work as a software architect at London Stock Exchange Group Technology. In my segment, I'll mostly talk about the cloud migration strategy and taking your application and making it cloud native and moving the system to the cloud, right? So we'll start off with the strategic decisions that we can take. Can you move to the slide? Okay, right. So the first is like before you start migration, right? So everyone's running a business. It's not just a technological thing that you are doing, right? End of the day, every one of us as software professionals are catering some sort of our customers, right? So, and we are trying to make our customers' lives better through software. So the investment that we make in technology needs to be reflected in business as well, right? So in terms of strategy, one of the first strategies that you need to think of is the cloud provider, right? So are you going to go a single cloud provider, or are you going to go multi-cloud providers, or are you going to go even cloud agnostic, right? So especially if you are into software as a service kind of business and you're in charge of choosing your infrastructure, going for a single cloud provider might be the way to go, right? So you do some extensive research and you think for all of my workloads, this is the cloud provider that suits best for you, right? The next strategy is, right, so you might have certain technologies, or let's say like the infrastructure, the messaging queues, and your database providers are really good in one cloud provider, and your web applications can run very smoothly in that cloud provider. But you also have a part of the application that has big data analytics, and you need to do streaming analytics. So you need to do some machine learning on your data and do some analytics and produce reports. And you just feel another cloud provider is much more advanced and has much better capability. So you sometimes need to split across multiple cloud providers as well, right? So come up with that strategy clean, because that comes with its benefit and also comes with additional complexities as well. Then some of us, right? So some of us have products, and we need to deploy for different customers, different product instances. And then typically you're not in charge of choosing the infrastructure. Your client also plays and has a role to play in giving you advice where they want their software to be deployed. So then you might need a strategy to be cloud agnostic, meaning your applications needs to be able to run on multiple clouds, right? So that's where things like containerization and container orchestration comes in really handy. So, right, your cloud provider strategy plays a vital role before you start the actual migration. And the use of managed services, right? So as the previous speakers also talked about, you are encouraged to use managed services, right? So obviously, if you are going to choose a managed database service or a managed queuing service, you are going to look at whether it like has all the features that your application needs. Along with that features, also make sure to have a look at the non-functional aspect or the non-feature aspects, right? So depending on the data that you deal with, does it comply with the security requirements, right? So does it have encryption at rest? Does it have valid authentication protocols for authenticating processes that communicate with these message buses or the databases, right? So think of those aspects as well if you're taking advantage of managed services, and the compliance requirements, right? So every application has SLAs, and you also have the recovery point objectives and the recovery time objectives. So are the managed services that you use in compliance and in par with those your applications RPO and RTO requirements? So put special attention on those as well. And then the support and vendor management, right? So you might need to take support from the cloud provider, and sometimes for some complicated technologies that your organization don't want to build the skill set by yourself, you'll depend on external vendors to provide that support for your application, right? So taking those considerations as well into your migration strategy, right? Because ultimately, like especially like Krishan mentioned, it's not only a technological thing, right? So it's process, the culture, everything matters. So how you deal with support and the vendor management is also a key part in your migration strategy. Right. Next slide, please, Pawan. Right. And then the other thing is, right, so no one wants to end up in the cloud and then realize that you are not achieving what you wanted to achieve, right? So establish your KPIs beforehand, right? Be it the user experience, the application performance, infrastructure, whatever it is, right? Lay out your key performance indicators before you start the actual migration, because this will affect your the application architecture as well. For example, let's say you have a particular response time KPI and your customers are accessing your software from two different geographic locations, let's say Australia and England, right? And to achieve that response time KPI, you might need to deploy your application in multiple geographic regions. So it affected your deployment architecture. So along with that, there might be regulatory requirements that says you cannot store this data across this geographic region, right? There's geographic boundary associated with that piece of data. So you're not able to replicate the data, or you're like, you need to mask the data if you're going to like do replication. So that affects your data architecture as well, right? So always like establish correct KPIs, and this also makes like everyone's life much easier, because like every stakeholder from the technology aspect and also from the business aspect now knows exactly what they are getting and how that is achieved. So before we start the physical migration or get all into too deep into hands dirty, establish a correct set of KPIs, and then once you do the actual migration, you can measure this along with uh, after the migration. It's easy to compare and you can measure it properly as well. Next slide, please. Right, then, so like many organizations, you are not going to, well, you're lucky if you are a startup and you can build fresh, but most of the cases in enterprises, you are not going to migrate your whole application at once. You can't do it with a big bang, right? So that's where lift and shift, lift, tinker and shift, and then things like strangler pattern comes into play, right? So in order to prioritize, right? So you obviously can't migrate everything at once. So you need to prioritize. So in order to prioritize, there are some key factors that can affect that prioritization. One is the impact it has, right? So you might choose to migrate a component which has the least amount of dependencies or least impactful, right? So you want to avoid the risk and you want to get more exposure in developing cloud native software and migrating into the cloud, right? So impact might be one criteria that you prioritize your migration. Then the maturity and the skills, right? So depending on your organization skill set, let's say you have a lot of experts in let's say Kafka like technology and machine learning. So you're very comfortable with that technology, and the managed services that's offered in the cloud are also very familiar to you. So you might think, yeah, this is the area that we need to go first because we know this area, this is our area, and we are very mature in this area. So let's do that first. Then it could be the business impact, right? Let's say your one of the components in your application is causing a bottleneck and your organization is not making enough revenue because of that. So at times that business impact might drive the prioritization, right? So you might think, in order to make more profits, let's do this thing first. And also compliance and the legal requirements also plays a key role, might be in prioritizing or even might be in deprioritizing, right? So you might think we need all of the previous 3 ticks clicked. And because of some compliance requirement, let's say the level of encryption that's needed for your data is not offered by that cloud provider yet. So, or in a particular product. So you might actually need to deprioritize migrating a component like that till that compliance requirements are met. So analyze all of those first before choosing and prioritizing which ones go first. Next slide, please. Then obviously, like when you're doing a migration or refactoring, choosing a modern architecture matters, right? So ultimately your software needs to be cloud native. So where do you start from, right? So obviously for me, this 12-factor application principles is a solid foundation and a good starting place, right? You have to start somewhere, right? So this is a good foundation for you to start. It's good if you are doing greenfield software development, and even if you're doing brownfield, you're refactoring or re-architecting, still 12 factors gives you a good solid foundation for building robust and scalable cloud native software in the cloud, right? So like embrace these principles well, because once you embrace these things like 12 factor applications and you build your application as microservices and you containerize those, then a lot of the heavy lifting that you yourself has to do will be minimized, because CNCF will like provide with good set of guidance, and there's also in their landscape good set of tools if your application is built upon these principles that integrate well. So then you don't have to reinvent or like all the things by yourself. So in the next slide, let's talk a little bit more and get into some of the key considerations that you need to think of, right? So especially if you're coming from a legacy world, and the chances are your applications were architected with the infrastructure that were there in that era, right? And automation might not be a key thing that you have. But when you're going cloud native, automation should be at the heart, right? So it's not only that you like do code check-ins, build and packaging and deployment, your infrastructure provisioning, your Kubernetes cluster provisioning, rolling out policies, provisioning your messaging queues, provisioning the databases. Everything has to be done in an automated way, right? There are no more pets. Everything is cattle now, right? So your infrastructure and everything that you do in the cloud, you have to treat them as cattle. So you have to have immutable infrastructure. You don't have like, Tallu starts anymore, right? So everything has to be automated, and you run the script, it has to be there, and you can't do tweaks manually, right? And then state, right? You have to be really smart with state, and you have to externalize state. This is like one of, I think like most of the early software that we built had this, right? To gain better performance or to have like the FT model it supported, we had state stored in memory, right? But when you go cloud native, having in-memory state is a disaster, right? You can't scale it, like you will have to write very complex and very custom load balancing algorithms to distribute the load once you have state in memory. And even recovering processes becomes really, really difficult. So be smart with your state and externalize state. Treat them as like, and move them to a backing service, like the 12-factor applications encourages as well, right? Write stateless processes. And communication, right? So it's kind of obvious and might not be obvious at the first place. Do you want to have API gateway kind of pattern where a lot of requests come to you and you distribute it among different microservices? Or if you have very custom UIs, whether making like backends for frontends make more sense, right? And also think about how your different microservices communicate in the backend. Are you going to use point-to-point communications? Are you going to use a messaging backbone that like facilitates that communication? And if you're choosing something like that, whether the security requirements is met with those, right? So think about how those processes are going to communicate, because early it might be just TCP/IP based communications or just REST communications. Now in cloud native world, you might transfer that layer to a service mesh or something that gives much flexibility, but that comes with complexity. So think about how you employ those communication strategies as well. So scalability is another key thing. Everybody, this is like a misinterpreted thing most of the time. A lot of people think once I put my software in the cloud, it's there. Its scalability is given. It just will like magically start scaling, which is not the case, right? So you are in charge of your application. How your application should scale is up to you, right? So if you don't expose correct metrics and you don't scale based on the correct metrics, you're not going to achieve your KPIs, and your scalability is not going to like benefit anybody, right? So CPU and memory are not the only metrics of scaling, especially if you're using message queues and things like that. The number of excess messages in the queue might not even affect the CPU and memory usage of your containers, right? So expose the correct metrics, use different tools to aggregate the metrics and do scaling, but it's your responsibility, it's application's responsibility to expose the correct set of metrics. And obviously monitoring and health, right? So there's no human intervention that we can like rely on if you are going cloud native, right? So you can't have alerts firing off and then someone going and saying, okay, this process has crashed, let me restart it, right? So the health check of the application needs to reflect that. If it can't connect to the database, if it can't pick or read messages from the messaging queue, it needs to be indicated and taken off, right? So that has to be done in automated base. So exposing correct monitoring and health checks to your application is vital. Obviously, traceability and logging, you can either do it in the application layer where you can introduce different relational IDs that tracks transactions, or you can move it to the infrastructure layer and have some tool that does the traceability for you, right? Doesn't matter at which level you do, think of it and do it, right? So otherwise you're going to end up in a disaster and someone calls and says, my payment didn't process, what happened? And by the time you're looking at that, the cluster or the container that ran that process is no longer there. So you need to have visibility and tracing. Security I put last because it's not important, just because I don't know where to start and stop. It might be a separate session itself, right? So do a proper threat modeling of your application. Think of security in each level. Think of the 4 C's of security, right? Think of the security in the cloud, the cluster, the container, and the code, right? And you do the threat model and define what level of security is applicable for you, right? Don't choose a tool. Just don't type container supply chain security and whatever comes up in that article doesn't mean that's the security requirement of your application. You do the threat model for your application, identify the security requirements, then choose a tool. If one tool is not enough, choose multiple tools, right? So security in the cloud is very, very important, because like when the perimeter security is changed, a lot of the things that we thought were secure is not secure anymore, right? So the trust boundary changes. So put a lot of consideration into security, right? So yeah, so those are some of the key considerations that you need to think of. And also, right, so don't stop, right? So cloud native journey is evolving journey, right? So you continuously evolve. Even if in the first time you get everything right, 100% right, the world doesn't stop there, right? So your software doesn't have to as well. So continuously evolve. So yeah, with that, I hand over to Ramesh.